Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. We've got a bunch of stuff to talk about today. This is the first day of the government shutdown that everybody has been anticipating for all this time. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about all the other 25 stories that have happened since we joined you. You joined us. I guess we joined each other a week ago. But before that, we have had, we did a live podcast, I think at the very end of last year in DC, and then we did one in the spring in Chicago. We've had a lot of people asking us, like, when are you going to do one in the tri-state area, the New York area? Well, we are doing one, and tickets went on sale for that just yesterday. We're doing it as part of, as part of larger TPM 25th anniversary celebration. But if you would like to hear Kate and I doing a live version of the podcast, you can join us on November 6th. It is in Manhattan at a place called the Metrograph Theater. And we're going to have a lot of fun. Like I said, we've done two of these before. And it's funny because, like, right now, I'm sitting here at my desk in front of my computer. Kate is doing the same thing. I don't know, 200 miles. I don't know exactly how far New York is from Washington, D.C. She's doing it there. Our producer, Jackie, Jackie will either be at home or at the office. The point is we do it remotely. Right. That's kind of the baseline, doing it remotely. And when we did the first one in Washington, D.C., I was sort of like, okay, this is going to be sort of weird. I'll be sitting right there with Kate, right? You develop a rapport or a dynamic based on a certain way of doing it. But it was great. So anyway, if you're a fan of the podcast, if you'd like to join us, again, it's November 6th. So anyway, come out and join us. It's a lot of fun. Get to meet Kate and I. It's funny, we had a live event in Boston last week. And when we do these, I go to most of them. The members of the staff who are actually organizing the event are there. And then we have a kind of a changing cast of people. It depends, who's closer, who's free, blah, 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 blah. And in any case, this was one that Kate was not there. Kate was not there, and Jackie was not there. Our producer was not there. And I cannot tell you how many people I talked to were like, "Where's Kate? I want to talk to Kate." Right? Kate was like the big star in absentia, and they were asking about Jackie too, as part of the podcast thing. Well, Kate and Jackie will be there on November 6th when we do this live podcast. So I hope you can join us. Again, you can find a bunch of ads on the site. If you're a member, there's going to be an email somewhere in your inbox. Grab a ticket, join us. Anyway, so let's get down to the podcast proper. Everything right now is through the prism of the shutdown, even the things we're going to talk about today that are not kind of like, narrowly tied to the shutdown. Everything is through that prism. So, Kate, you're our person not our only person. We have a few people in DC, but you are down there. I am not. So what are you thinking? Day one, how's it look?
Day one. Well, I guess we should say, as proponents of Democrats withholding the votes, good job. They did it, right? There was no last minute capitulation a la March. It almost kind of drained some drama out of the situation, right? Because last night, we just had kind of a couple show votes on the Democratic CR, and the House passed Republican one. Those more or less went the way you would assume. I would say A few of the kind of more squishy centrist Democrats did vote for the House Republican CR. That was Fetterman, which we already knew, and then Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada and Angus King of Maine. We didn't know those latter two until they actually took the votes,
Yeah.
which I think, you don't want to read a million things into it, because there is this dynamic where leadership more or less knows where a vote is going. And if you have kind of more vulnerable people who are like, please just let me off the leash on this one, not going to make a difference, there could have been some of that going on. I do think the fact that what they need, and Rand Paul stuck by his guns, at least, again, on this vote, that didn't really matter much. But that puts Democrats in the position of needing 8 people. They had 3 at this first kind of vote
Right.
of most conviction. So, not 0, right? It shows maybe it would not be all that hard for a handful more to kind of come on over. But
But to your
go ahead.
point, though Fetterman's in one category, he's probably like rogue here. But I don't think that's the case. As you said, leadership would have known in advance that they would have had a conversation. They might have liked it, but they were in the loop there. So it's, they probably have some control over the situation that it's, well, but we'll see. Anyway, continue. My apologies.
Right. Okay. And since then, we're just seeing a big kind of media footprint, right? Like, everyone's trying to get their people out on shows. They're doing like 8 billion press conferences a day. The House Democrats have been coming to the Hill. House Republicans are still not there. That was part of their kind of jamming the Senate strategy, to just not even have a quorum so the House couldn't possibly do anything. And House Democrats have kind of been using that absence as a kind of background for their stunts type thing. They did a really big press conference yesterday with like a gajillion of them on the steps saying, House Republicans are nowhere to be found, blah, blah, blah. But there have been a few developments, even in this first 24 hours, that I think reaffirm the notion that Democrats should have withheld their votes. Because I think Republicans are already kind of doing things that it muddies a political dynamic, which I think should probably favor them. And a few of those things are, so we had before this kind of like scary OMB memo of, if we shut down, there's going to be these mass firings and agencies are going to be brought to their knees. And that was kind of a stick, right? Afterwards, Russ Vogt sent out, a missive to all the agencies saying like, okay, put those plans into work, right? Time to chop some heads, time to, you know, let some blood. He did that. And then his first kind of targeted move was to withhold funding from a couple New York infrastructure projects in the name of not funding DEI, right? But a transparently obvious, where is the Democratic congressional leadership from? They're New Yorkers, right? So he's like, we're going to
Right.
hit them where it hurts, kind of thing. And I just think both of those things are like pretty stupid. The layoffs and firings and restructuring of the government piece, because right now, what Republicans clearly see as their best, cleanest argument is, hey, we just want to keep the government open. This is a clean document. Nobody should have any trouble with this. It's Democrats who are being obstructionists. And then they're turning around and like using the shutdown publicly to kind of make good on their vision of a restructured federal government. So it already muddies that water of, well, we don't want to do this at all, right? And so you have that piece. And then you have this punitive piece, which on top of Trump tweeting out an AI video of like Chuck Schumer swearing about Democrats and Jeffries in a sombrero for kind of whatever reason, like those moves are making it so much harder for Democrats to capitulate, right? You had this like hugely offensive video, and then this idea of like, hey, also we're going to go after, your city, your state, your stuff. I mean, all of that would just make Democrats look so much lamer if they cave. So I think the clearest shot for Republicans is to act like they're being the grown-ups in the room and hope that everyone kind of forgets about all the dysfunction they've been doing and just be like, "Hey man, we're just trying to run our government, like wish we could." And they are so at this point ideologically vindictive that they can't even behave like that in public.
The last, I mean, the whole point, but I'm particularly taken by your last point when you mentioned, their inability to be the grown-ups, because that is the play here. You want to say, hey, we're trying to run a government here, you know, have the mail delivered, have the all that kind of stuff. And what are you doing? You're withholding these votes, all the bad stuff. But the Republican Party in its present form, the MAGA Republican Party, is characterologically, ideologically unable, militantly against being a grown up. Its whole aesthetic is teenage, right? That whole kind of, lashing out, kind of dominance hierarchies, kind of Lord of the Flies kind of, kind of thing. So you're right. It's funny. I did a short piece about this several days ago, and then I did a longer piece about this this morning, basically saying I've always thought this was a bluff. I don't think they're going to do it. Maybe they are, but to operate within the metaphor that you were using, they're on the one hand saying like, "Oh, shutdown is terrible. Democrats, this is so bad. Everybody's suffering," but also we're going to do a permanent shutdown. We're going to just fire everybody forever. Um, the thing is, one thing we know is they don't need the shutdown to fire more people. They showed in the spring they both are willing to do it and they have the judicial backing to do it. They can fire as many people as they want. And the news on this front in the last month or so is they're actually hiring back a non-trivial number of federal workers now. And they're not doing that because they started believing in good government or anything. They're doing it because certain things started breaking down. And that caused them trouble with certain Republican stakeholder interests or just started making them less popular. So they started hiring them back. So that tells me they know they have sort of maxed out the firing in their interests, right? So I don't think they're going to do more. They can say they will, but I think again they're telling us where they think their self-interests are by not having done more firings and actually hiring people back. And they can make these arguments about, oh, it opens up new opportunities. No, it doesn't. It actually doesn't. It doesn't open up new opportunities. So I don't really. It could happen. I guess I would say this. I think, and the other global point is, we're a year away from the midterm elections. That election is going to come down to how people think things are going. How's the economy? How's inflation? Are there, flight delays because of people been fired at the FAA? All this kind of stuff. They own the government, they are the government. They own the atmosphere in the country. So if they start firing everybody, that is going to cause them problems because people actually want the government to be working, and it's already pretty bare boned. So that part I'm confident of. And that's why I'm skeptical of the threats, because I don't think they're going to harm themselves in doing it. Now, maybe they, could be, but the other problem there is that, like, let's say, it is to Kate's point. It's certainly possible that Republicans can just win the, DC shutdown argument here. We're running the government. You guys have some other stuff that has already been decided that you're trying to undo, and to leverage us, you're trying to shut down the government. And maybe they'll work on that. But if they fire everybody, that means that they're going to be still having that shutdown thing 6 months from now, after the Democrats presumably have given in you know, way in the past, and it's still going on. I just don't I just don't buy that. They haven't people I haven't seen anybody been fired yet. I guess we'll see. You know, they had Vance go out and say, "Hey, I'm happy to come up there to the Hill." You know, it's kind of like they're letting Junior out, right? Or kind of like riding a bike for the first time. I'll come down to the Hill. I'll work out this ACA subsidy. Um, uh, uh, you know, conflict with you guys, make that work. But you gotta open the government first. Not going to do it, you know, under coercion. Well, okay, no, right? I mean that's silly. But to me, again, that I don't know. That doesn't project a lot of strength to me. And I do think one thing Democrats are benefiting for to some extent, and I would almost say it's not a sufficient condition for anything. It's more like a necessary condition though, and it goes to the point that Kate was just making. Everyone knows that Jeffries and Schumer, at least for the time being, just have no exit here. They cannot give in. They'll probably like if it happened again, they would be it would be such a catastrophe for them that they know they can't. And the fact that everybody knows they can't, that they have to do this at least for a while, um, shapes the conversation, right? That you don't have, oh, are they giving in today? Are they giving in this? Blah blah blah. Blah. Everybody knows that those guys are, for the time being, just totally locked in, and that is something that Republicans usually benefit from, right? Just this knowledge of like they can't give in. They have no leeway to give in.
I want to talk about one piece of this, which we debated a lot and which was really just a topic of debate coming into the shutdown, which was what should be the ideological argument for Democrats not giving their votes to the Republicans, right? And, we've been through all this. It kind of spanned the gamut of authoritarian stuff to more kind of pocketbook stuff to more procedural stuff, right? The upending of the budgetary process. And, some people are still very chagrined that Democrats kind of ended up on this healthcare point, right? The ACA subsidies. I think the kind of prevailing argument in favor of those are, it's terrain that all kinds of Democrats are pretty comfortable fighting on, in a way that they're not the authoritarian stuff. And there's the possibility of actual concessions because should the subsidies lapse, I mean, the Kaiser Family Foundation had a new, document out yesterday that showed it would more than double the out of pocket premium costs for enrollees. So, this would be a huge thing that people would notice, that Republicans did. So
And before
Republicans
the
have,
election, well before the election.
right.
Yeah.
And so Republicans have a good amount of incentive to want to kind of roll this back. My biggest problem with the healthcare thing, honestly, even uh, I buy a little, I do agree a little bit with like the incoherence thing, how it's not really connected to this other stuff. Um, but I've more been like, I think you need to kind of let Republicans put their hands on the hot stove and pay the price for their own legislating instead of like constantly bailing them out in a way that voters will not recognize.
Right.
But all that being said, I do think that Democrats gave themselves some leeway to expand the argument a little bit. First, in their own CR, which had the healthcare stuff, but which also insisted on, a rewriting of the rescission rules
Yep.
to no
Yep.
longer let Trump just go into congressional budgets and say, hey, I actually don't want to spend that. So they've given themselves, I think, an expansion of the argument in that direction. And I've never been totally sold on this idea that like what the Democrats initially shut down the government for has to be their like only argument throughout. Like it's not that hard for me to see that being something that mutates. This is something Republicans do all the time, right? I mean,
Yeah.
look at the Charlie Kirk shooting type thing. It was like, we've been going this way for a while, and now that this has happened, we have to crack down, right? Like they're always kind of using external events as pretext to kind of do things they were already going to do. There's no reason that Democrats can't kind of turn around and say the same thing, right? Say like, we're we're here to help the American people. We are absolutely fighting for healthcare. And by the way, insert some kind of atrocity, right? Like an ICE agent just, concussed a little kid while bringing someone into detention. We just cannot support that kind of government. Like to me, I think this is something that could naturally kind of mutate and grow, and that wouldn't feel so incoherent. I think you could even do that in a way that feels a little more natural than the like talking points obsession with this can only be about healthcare, like why can't it be about multiple things?
Yeah.
Nobody thinks they're really going to win here. So
Yeah, there's I totally agree. And this goes back to in a way it is part of the Democrats sort of larger issue of policy literalism and the kind of mindset you get if you have like some advanced degree or something like that, that they can make it whatever they want to make it, or they can make it something different tomorrow. And if things are developing in a way that they want to shift their focus, they can do whatever they want. And as you say, they have their sort of opening menu was uh, undo the Medicaid cuts, put back the ACA subsidies, and end this rescission stuff. And the rescission stuff is actually a big part of the authoritarian equation. In some ways, it's one of the biggest because if Congress doesn't control spending, there is no Congress, right? We already, I mean, its other powers are already greatly atrophied. And I think, more generally, people know what's happening in the country right now. People know what's happening with ICE and the deportation stuff, the sending the military and the guard to American cities, universities. People may like it or not, but people know that's kind of where we are as a country. That is sort of the series of choices uh, that we're facing. So again, I think it is being way too over literal for anybody to say, "Wait a second, you said it was healthcare and rescissions. If you're going to turn it into now kind of a broader argument about militarization of society, whoa, ho, ho, what are we talking? I mean, you do whatever you want. So that part doesn't really. I don't think that's a problem. And again, the rescission thing, it covers a lot of territory and it's actually very important. One point I'll make about when you were saying that there's, Republicans are also worried about these ACA subsidies, it does create this kind of interesting dynamic. And I think, Kate, you were the one who flagged in the live blog yesterday some reporting that kind of alluded to this, that there's a paradoxical kind of arrangement of who's on which side. The White House kind of wants to bring those back too because they don't want to lose the midterm, right? So you've got frontline Republicans who are spooked about that. I think the smarter people in the White House are spooked about it for those reasons. Meanwhile, you've got the sort of the Thune Johnson types, the sort of semi older school, not older school that they're sort of like good old Republicans, but people who are fairly ideological, right? In a way that Trump is not, who are like, we're not, that's good policy. We don't want to do that. We don't want to undo any of that. So it kind of, it creates a dynamic that is ripe with the ability for Democrats to kind of wrong shoe the Republicans because the sides are kind of twisted in a funny way.
totally. And I think this thing, the kind of obsession with like Democrats need to be fighting about one thing and not everything, I think it stems out of kind of two beliefs, one of which is the whole people have decided that being against Trump isn't enough, right? That's kind of what the 2024 election demonstrated, that Democrats have to be for something, not just against. And, I think there's some people are taking as proof of that the fact that even while Trump is polling pretty poorly and pretty unpopularly, Democrats are not directly reaping the benefits of that kind of loss of faith in Trump. I think and when we're kind of taking on faith that that's a demonstration of that argument, I think you could also kind of make a plausible argument that not fighting Trump hard enough or being seen as fighting Trump hard enough would leave you kind of in that same deficit. But
Yeah.
that's the one belief. And then I think the other is a little more attenuated, but it comes from people felt that the first time around the kind of protest movements to Trump were stronger. I guess that mostly just comes out of the fact that the George Floyd ones were so historically large and diverse and kind of eye-catching in a way that other protests aren't. And I've seen some criticism about the protests this time around being more of kind of an anti-MAGA grab bag, right? Like the No King's Day kind of umbrella covers the whole kit and caboodle of Trump's kind of authoritarian impulses and everything that stems from that. But I just don't think we have a lot of non like vibes based data that kind of backs any of that up. It's just become the conventional wisdom of what the 2024 election told us. So I think we're just using these things that are not really like hard data to say like, and this is how Democrats should act in the shutdown, which I just think, and all of this is trying to get away from like consultant brainy, inauthentic stuff. And I think it leads you to a place that is like a little consultant brainy and inauthentic because, Democrats kind of did what you want, right? Like they're being somewhat myopic in their talking points about why they're shutting down the government. And I think it's a little discordant. It's a little bit weird to kind of know that Democrats are opposed to the whole gamut of this behavior and kind of how the government is being weaponized and everything, and just say, well, as long as we extend the ACA subsidies, everything else is okay. So I don't know. I'm just of the camp that I think more of a morphing, grab baggy approach, I think that's fine. And I think people understand that. And I think, to your kind of twisting and knots point, there's some just overworking of this idea that like, well, voters are only going to be able to understand it if you kind of give them one thing to hold in their head and you just like repeat it a billion times. And I'm sure it'll raise the salience of the healthcare thing, and that's good. But I don't know that it would be either hard to understand or off-putting for voters if Democrats just did a more kind of comprehensive like, yeah, we don't like what's going on here, so they don't get our votes for free. I think that's fine as well.
And it's also fine to say, we're on the side of against this stuff. Trump is not popular. He's like underwater by like 12 points. He's like consistently in the low 40s. He's not popular. The individual things he's doing tend to be more unpopular than that. People, it's a cliche to say we're a highly polarized society. You're kind of for Trump or against him. And what Democrats are saying, we're the against ones. And it's totally fine to say, and we're focusing right now on these healthcare things. That seems doable. That's fine. We're against everything, but this is what we're, in this kind of short window where we have some power. We're going to focus on this healthcare stuff and rescissions. That doesn't mean that like you took your finger off the chess piece and like, oh, I guess you're not against anything else. That doesn't make sense. That's again some over literal nonsense. And my global theory of this entire thing is that to be in opposition, you've got to oppose stuff. You have to take the very limited times when you have actually some power and say, we're going to oppose, because that's what an opposition does. And not just because that's some sort of like you get caught up on a dictionary definition or something like that, but you've got to show people, okay, we're here, we're doing opposing, and get your stop your side from being so demoralized and everything like that. And so that's why at a basic level, I have I have always been against overthinking this too much, because I think this is really all about the visuals that the Democrats are actually getting into the ring with Trump and having a fight with him, and that is going to not even sure pay dividends. It will start undoing the damage of their mix of passivity and sense of overwhelm. And what do we do? Oh no, I guess we have to be nice, or else he'll hurt us more. The most demoralizing and debilitating way of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, and now we're into this is kind of the no man's land, right? It's like I think everyone felt like pretty strongly up until the moment of shutdown, and then everything else from here is a little bit murky. And part of that is because, Josh, as you've written, there just haven't been too many shutdowns. Like we really don't have a lot of history to extrapolate from on this, particularly with this political composition, right? It's almost always Republicans who are kind of the more active ones in doing the shutdown. Um, so
Can I
I
can I
think,
make just one
yeah,
one really quick point there, Kate?
hmm
The Most of them were under Obama, to a lesser extent with Clinton. In all those cases, it was essentially the Freedom Caucus, the right of the Republican caucus, demanding things that there was no way you could get through a vote. And this is very different. When Republicans canceled these programs, it was it was very unpopular. So that we have very few examples, and that is another, I think, pretty significant difference that people haven't factored into the equation. I apologize for
no,
interrupting.
no, no. So there's that piece, and then there's also what you would just kind of call the preemptive polls, right? Like the beginning polls before the shutdown really happened of who people would blame. And most of the ones we have, by a fairly healthy margin, have people kind of instinctually blaming Republicans. And I mean, that makes sense, right? Like you said, most of our shutdowns have been along those fault lines with, Republican members of Congress trying to make things difficult for Democratic presidents, specifically Obama. I think you have baked in this notion that, Democrats are the hall monitors. They're the class presidents, right? They like the government, and Republicans are the ones who want to drown it in a bathtub. So, they're just more naturally kind of posited on those sides of the fault lines. So, and I don't say that to suggest that that opinion will hold necessarily. It might. It's going to be stress tested a little bit because right-wing media is going to be saying it's all Democrats' fault. Mainstream media is going to be saying it's all Democrats' fault. As soon as we get kind of a few days of this under our belts, especially as soon as any kind of pain point emerges, whether that be, TSA or, historically it's been things like national parks, stuff that people care about. Um, will That's when those kind of themes in right wing and mainstream media are going to be hammered every day. That's when all the questions to Democrats are going to be, is enough, right? Troops aren't getting paid. Are you really going to exert this kind of pain on XYZ? Like, when are you going to give in? I think it's fairly inevitable that we're going to reach a point where that becomes the narrative and that becomes what's kind of driving the reporting. Um, and I have no idea what will happen at that point or when it'll happen. Our news cycles are so fast right now that we could be there in as soon as a few days. It's going to be driven in a large part by like conventional wisdom of when people start to think Democrats are going to get shaky, and everyone kind of knows they'll hold out for at least 12 hours, right? So we're not there yet. And public sentiment may well kind of shift along with that saturation, but it does suggest to me that at least in these beginning days when the story is newest and most interesting as well, Democrats have some room to run. So I think this is going to be a good, both, as you say, just for their political fortunes, they have to fight. And also, as has been our real recurring theme on this podcast, they've got to develop these muscles, right? Like they got
Right.
to practice this kind of thumbing your nose at, Republicans and Hill reporters kind of thing in order to, whenever they take back power, have the muscle memory to be able to enact these kind of giant reforms that are somewhat unimaginable right now.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And there was something you said before at the beginning of the episode about everybody doing, everybody hitting the TV shows and doing press conferences and stuff. And it's funny, I had something this morning when you were in our business and you're on these mailing lists on Sundays, you get a thing, ABC News exclusive. We talked to Mike Johnson and he said this and blah 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 blah. And when I was looking at my email this morning, I started seeing those. Stephanopoulos got this exclusive and this exclusive and this, and I'm like, what's going on? Like, did they not send these out for the weekend? What happened? And after after a few moments, I realized, oh, everybody's going on TV nonstop because they're trying to get their shutdown message on. So that all makes perfect sense. Look, the worst case scenario for Democrats, which I don't think is that bad a scenario, is you go to Matt for some indeterminate period of time. And at a certain point, you say, okay, uh, in the interests of whatever, we're going to have to do this. And that's still much, much better than just having done it on day one. That's much, much better. It's even if you don't get a big thing. But I will say this, because at least you're saying, look, we fought for a while. It didn't seem like we were getting anywhere. We had to make a tough decision, as opposed to just saying like, well, it's I don't think we're gonna win. So can we just not do anything? Like, it's so demoralizing. But here is the thing that, to go back to another point you made about the grown-ups in the room, we have the wild card of President Trump. And the standard script here is that the president, whether it's Clinton or Obama or whatever, the president does a spectacle of normality. I am here trying to president, trying to make the government work, being normal, and all these freaks are just being freaks, and that's the contrast. The sort of irresponsible legislators, blah 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 blah. Donald Trump can't do that. That is beyond him. And so he's a wild card here. When you were saying, you don't know how things are going to develop. Well, in the old days, we knew how they were going to develop in the sense of uh, what the president was going to do. Sort of, we saw it with the Biden debt limit stuff 2 years ago. I guess I lose track of how many years ago. Can't remember if it was 20. I think it was the end of 2023. In any case, Trump's a wild card that could turn things in very strange directions because look, it's Donald Trump. He's going to do some weird thing that is going to not just upset people, but maybe just throw things in a weird direction. Even today, and to your point, yes, the mainstream media is going to they're not going to say, well, you've been kind of ruling by decree for the last 8 months, and Democrats are just kind of saying here they need some stuff because you need them now. They're going to say, Democrats, when are you going to let the government open back up again? But I saw even today there were a lot of questions like, was it really right for the president to like post a video with like Hakeem Jeffries wearing a sombrero and having a little like, sort of, caricature sombrero wearing mustache? Like, what was that about? So, that kind of stuff, it, it it just changes things. It screws up that we're the adults. I'm here trying to do my presidenting narrative that these, always turn by.
And then on top of that, you have Trump's just kind of weird, like, I mean, it's funny because he's such a bully, but he also has a little bit of this like sycophanty thing where we've had a lot of stories of this where he'll just be kind of like horrible to some Democrat in public all the time, right? Like there was just a story in Kamala's book about this where every time he talks about her, he's like, she's low IQ, whatever, all variations on a theme. And then when he talks to her in private, there was a couple phone calls she talked about in the book, he says like, "Oh, you're great, you're tough," blah blah blah. He just it's weird. He's not very good at kind of in-person conflict despite his whole thing. And so we have reporting that in this White House meeting on Monday with Schumer's, Jeffries, Johnson, and Thune, that Trump was like, you know what? Obamacare sucks. Like, why don't we just like all draw up a new plan? Like, why don't we do that together? And Thune reportedly was getting really exasperated because he was like, "This isn't about healthcare. Like, that's the Democrats' argument. We're not buying that." But it plays into this idea of how Thune and Johnson were like really worried when initially Trump was just going to meet with the Democrats because obviously they're afraid he's going to give away the farm. Like when you have someone who's completely ideologically unmoored, sometimes he doesn't know or he forgets what side of a position he's supposed to be on. And because he has this kind of, glad handy sycophantic thing about him, there's always a concern that he could be kind of, massaged into coming out in some way that
For
completely kind of
Obamacare
blows
Plus.
up.
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So
Like, let's just do
I
universal
totally
health care. We'll simplify
yeah,
everything. What about that?
exactly. Wouldn't that be easier? Wouldn't that be better? Exactly. So I think his, like, childish tendencies on top of his just complete lack of any knowledge or interest, like, in the policies themselves, completely, as you say, like, makes him an additional wild card here.
There was that, I don't know if listeners saw this, but there was the whole thing about Portland, sending the military to Portland, that whole thing. The governor of Oregon had a conversation with Trump, and as it was reported, basically Trump had seen stuff on Fox about like bonfires in Portland and everything. It turned out this Fox footage was from 2020, June 2020, when everything was every video they showed was like, kind of buildings on fire and everything. And again, as reported in that call, the governor was like, that's literally, just to be clear with you, Mr. President, that's literally not happening. And he was like, I saw it on TV. And then he was asked about it later, and he's like, well, it turns out it maybe wasn't happening. It was so strange. She said it wasn't happening. And so you sort of see this. There's so many perverse and ridiculous levels to this guy. On the one hand, when he is in his dominant mode, it's all for show. It's all talk. That's why he can be saying Kamala is a low IQ hag, and then talks to her and like, hey, good work. I love what you're doing. You're strong. You're whatever. And some of that is because it's all for show. Some of that is because he's clearly a conflict averse, perversely, he's a conflict averse person. He can be there on the hustings saying, lock her up and all this kind of stuff. But in the meetings, he seems to be seldom like that. And you can even see that in how how the backbiting and personnel stuff works in his world. People are on the outs, but he doesn't want to tell them they're on the outs. He hopes they get the message they're on the outs and just leaves, and doesn't force him to have an uncomfortable moment. And then perhaps especially with people like Chuck Schumer, there's a big part of Trump's life that is still from when guys like Chuck Schumer would take his checks, but didn't want to be seen with him because he's an embarrassment. So there's also that sense that he's always want to be accepted and all that. So all that shit is operating at the same time. So yeah, it makes sense. And, kind of getting to that point I made earlier, that Johnson and Thune, these are guys who actually want to cut health care. For Trump, it's just still this hang up he had with Obama, that Obamacare is the worst thing ever. Any details beyond that, don't matter for Trump.
Exactly. Okay, so we're going to end with a little Supreme Court corner because there's been an awful lot of news on that beat in the past few days, including today. We're recording on our usual Wednesday afternoon, and this morning, the court handed down just a temporary order keeping Lisa Cook, the Federal Reserve governor, in her position at least until oral arguments scheduled for January 2026. Um, and that is a pretty big tea leaf because we've now been through the court greenlighting firings from every agency imaginable, right? They're going to probably formalize the overturning of these protections from at will firings for certain independent agencies in December in the Humphreys executor case. And the big question since the beginning was, well, what about the Fed? Because for a long time, even from conservative circles that don't like executive branch agencies, largely because they're mostly regulatory bodies, even still, those people have been nervous about the Fed because when you have a non independent central bank, what the economy is going to be completely trashed as a result of that. So the big question is the Supreme Court going to kind of hold that bright line even while they're trampling over every other one in regards to agencies? And we've had little crumbs here and there where they say, well, the Fed is different. The Fed is special. You get the sense they're going to kind of come up with a reason why it's different, later on. And today's order was another sign of that. By keeping her in her job for now, it's not a promise, but they're suggesting that they're probably going to find a way to keep the Fed insulated from Trump.
Yeah, I've always assumed they were going to do this, and as you say, I think they actually went for that. Well, the Fed is pretty old, and in fact, it is based on the first and second banks of the United States, and those go back to the very beginning. So there it's back to kind of like things that are super old are okay, and none of that makes any sense. That the Fed is actually not like the first and second bank of the United States, and that the regional banks are like those, and that they are semi-private and everything. The Fed, like the national Fed, isn't at all. So it makes no sense, but that's fine because uh, wealth does not like inflation. And fundamentally, the reason that central banks are insulated from direct political control is that the kind of things that are always in the short and medium term interests of the incumbent government are the kind of things that over time probably going to drive up inflation. And so, kind of like it's stupid, but like it's the one case where I guess we're glad that they're not feeling the need to be consistent, which they never are, and yeah, so they're gonna find some stupid reason why this is why the Fed is different, even though it's not different at all.
I know. I have to admit, I kind of started the beginning of Trump's term when I started doing some reporting on this, thinking same as you, right? Like that they would find a way to kind of wall off the Fed and reverse engineer some kind of explanation. And I'm back to thinking that now, but I have to say in the kind of interregnum period, I was losing my confidence in that. In part because not so much the agencies, like it's not really a surprise that the most historically anti-agency court would also do away with the independent ones. That's kind of part and parcel. But another case we wanted to talk about on Friday, the court greenlit the pocket rescissions quote unquote theory, which just a reminder is this idea cooked up by Russ Vogt that if you kind of submit paperwork within the last final days of the fiscal year, the president can zero out any appropriation that he wants. I mean, it's completely insane. Like, so on every piece of it, it's silly. The statute that it's obviously violating is really clear. That law was passed precisely in reaction to a president doing what Trump is trying to now. It just could not be more explicit that this isn't how it works. And even if you didn't know that law, you're taught as a little kid, Congress is in charge of the money. That's kind of how we keep the president from becoming a king. And the Supreme Court said that they were okay with it. Well, the right wing majority did, and that was when I was doing some reporting around that, even some experts on rescissions and impoundment stuff were like, "I don't know. They're like, "It's insane." They said, "Of course, this court really likes Trump and doesn't like saying no to Trump, but it is just such a defilement of the separation of powers that, it might be a bridge too far," and evidently not. I mean, when it comes to the all-powerful executive, this court has denied him almost nothing. I mean, and the administration is acting accordingly. That same day, they kind of re-upped their ask for the Supreme Court to take up the birthright citizenship executive order, which listeners will remember reached the court before, but only on this question of national injunction. So now they're trying to get the meat of it back in front of them. But I think that is just another suggestion of how they might even be surprised by how pliable the court has been on any question of kind of executive power.
Didn't they make on the rescission question, didn't they make the decision on the basis of the statute, not the constitutionality?
That's right. They said somehow that this organization who's going to see all of its funding zeroed out by the rescission doesn't have well, they implied that they are not going to have standing to sue, and that's going to be the little kind of procedural workaround they're going to try to use.
It's interesting because there's a reader who I correspond with, and this has been a running conversation for us. But he made a point that people um, people have this idea, and Schedule F that got a bunch of attention at the beginning of the year is another example of this. People have this idea like, wow, they come up with these ingenious arguments, right? To like no one ever thought of that. And this reader made the point of, it's sort of as though someone said, well, uh, a crowbar is a long piece of metal with a kind of a hook, a blunt, sort of turned around hook at the end, right? Okay, that's a crowbar. But then Russ Volk comes along and says, holds up a hammer. Look, there's a long piece of metal, little thing protruding out. It's a crowbar, right? I mean, it fits the description, right? And the way that the legal commentary and the news commentary um, has worked for some time now, or certainly in this calendar year, is to say, "Wow, how'd Russ come up with that? That's ingenious." What a workaround. When you're like, okay, like if we're gonna pretend that a crowbar, we know what a crowbar means. We all know what it means. It's a crowbar. This is a hammer. If you want to pretend that kind of like they're the same thing, then yeah, I guess that's ingenious. But that's just because we're pretending something that isn't real. And almost all of these legal arguments are the same thing. They come up with something that is a very known word, a very known legal concept, and basically say, let's pretend it means something different. And if the people who call the shots say, okay, yeah, okay, yeah, let's pretend that is different, then suddenly everything is ingenious and everything is possible. And this it almost would be better if they had made the rescission argument on a constitutional basis, because then at least there's some argument, not a good one. It's very, very clear that the people who wrote the Constitution wanted to put the budgetary power with the Congress, but they've been dead for a super long time. So who knows what they thought? We know what the people thought in the early 70s after what Richard Nixon tried to do. This wasn't what they thought. So this is another aspect of this Supreme Court just coming up with willfully false interpretations of what the law was intended to do. And then, everything is ingenious, everything's possible.
And the last thing we want to talk about on the Supreme Court front is that late last week after we recorded, Clarence Thomas made one of these kind of rare public appearances. He went to Catholic. and he was talking about precedent, the role of stare decisis. And he gave this little speech about how we can't just turn off our brains and just decide that precedent is right. We can't blindly walk into things. And I just, and we already know Thomas wrote in Dobbs, he wants to revisit Griswold, which is contraceptives, Lawrence, which is consensual sex. The whole universe of these kind of right, pr- privacy based rights, he thinks are all kind of up for grabs, in addition to, Humphreys, which is the independent agency, and they're going for the use of race and redistricting, right? Like all across the board. But I want to read this quote that he said, just from kind of the mind of one of our brilliant jurists. We never go to the front, see who's driving the train, where it's going. And you could go up there in the engine room, find it's an orangutan driving the train. So
Well, there you go. I guess that
it's
makes sense. I mean,
hard to
I
add to
get,
that.
yeah, I guess it. Well, it's funny because I would say that yes, that this is true, and almost the entire jurisprudence of this court, really, not so much the entire Roberts court. Roberts changed pretty significantly, I would say, in like 2019, 2020. That until then, it was. I think you could say, at least to a significant extent, it was a hard right ideological court. That it was mostly, although I can think just off the top of my head a number of exceptions, saying we are going to uh, impose and flesh out the Federalist Society jurisprudence, right, about what's possible, anti-regulatory, all that kind of stuff, and Civil Rights Act, blah 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 blah. Since then, it has been very much a matter of let's go see who's driving the train. And if it's Biden driving the train, that's got to figure pretty heavily into the thinking, right? Because Biden's bad. And if it is, ironically, given that description, the orange orangutan, Trump, that's good, right? So, so the funny thing is, he's sort of, it was such a funny quote to me because that is actually totally what they do. They are not really concerned about jurisprudence in the sense of some sort of consistent framework for interpreting the Constitution, or judicial restraint, which is what stare decisis is really about. Kind of, things that have been done a certain way for a long time. You don't upset that apple cart. That it's like, let's see who's driving the train. This is all about who's driving the train, and if the bad guy's driving the train, uh, uh, we gotta have a very weak executive, and vice versa. So I don't know. Maybe he's getting old. He's kind of speaking his mind unintentionally.
Which I also thought was one of your best points in the ed blog you wrote recently about Supreme Court reform, which we've talked about on the pod before. But this idea that if you don't reform it, that the Supreme Court is going to be all about restraining the executive again next time it's a Democrat, right? It's only going to be this kind of carte blanche, do whatever you want when it's a Republican. So, it's important to have that in the bloodstream, because we're still at a point where even suggesting like something as anodyne as, or term limits or an extra seat or two. I mean, you would have the vast, vast, vast majority of the Democratic caucus in Congress right now saying they oppose those things. And next time Democrats have power, it's got to be a big overhaul, So good to
Yeah,
get that in
yeah,
the
yeah. No,
ether.
that's also why a lot of you have Democrats, and in some cases Republicans, saying, well, this decision, but what about the next time it's a Democrat? Are you going to be comfortable with that power for them? Democrats saying, are you going to want
Mhm.
us to have that power? Republicans, sort of the way that Ted Cruz said with the ABC stuff, that's going to be crazy when Democrats, don't worry about it. Democrats
Not
aren't
going
going
to
to have that
happen.
power. That's not going to
No.
happen, because the idea that you're going to walk into the Supreme Court and say, here's the decision under Trump, and John Roberts and Sam Alito are going to go, he's got us there. I guess we're
All right,
stuck.
President AOC, go ahead.
Yeah,
Do
yeah,
your
yeah,
worst.
yeah. That is living in such a fantasy world. It just drives me crazy. So yeah. Okay.
All right. Another good week in the books.
Another good week in the books. Remember, if you want to see us live, you can buy tickets for the live podcast we're doing on November 6th, part of our 25th anniversary celebration. Tickets went on sale yesterday. And for this episode, I think that's all we got. Yeah?
All right. See you next week.
Cool. Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.